Hey there, I'm Steve Herod, and I'm on my third career. First, I was an operator. As CTO of VMware, I helped scale a pretty small startup at the time into one of the world's fastest growing software companies. Second, I was a venture capitalist, a partner at General Catalyst. I had shifted over to the other side of the table, investing in all sorts of visionary founders and interesting startups. And now I'm on my third career, mixing investor and operator roles. I'm launching companies with amazing co-founders as a partner at Juxtapose. So over the years, I've navigated some pretty interesting career juxtapositions, and this podcast is all about exploring those. Each episode, I'll sit down with some of the brightest minds in business and hear how they manage their own career shifts. That would include some of the lessons they learned, the insights that might help you along the way as you're navigating your own career path. My goal is to offer practical takeaways, honest reflections, and inspiration so you can make your next move with confidence. I think I first met you in 2013, Andrew.
Sounds about right.
We were both a little younger back then, but I think we've aged like fine wine or something like that.
I'm going to go with that.
Yeah. So Andrew is well known as the CEO of Illumio, one of the hottest cybersecurity companies. I've been fortunate to be a board member there for 10 years, but he's also been, was a head of sales for a previous startup. He's advised several companies, and he's very well known on the customer side of things, which we'll talk about. But why don't we just start with where we are today, Andrew? Tell us what Illumio is, and we'll start with that, and we'll go backwards in time to how you got here.
Fair enough. And obviously starting there is exciting because that's the fun part, is what we're working on now and what we're going to do going forward. The journey's been amazing, and thanks for having me today so I can talk about it for a couple of minutes. Obviously, if somebody says to me today, what is Illumio or what does Illumio do for its customers? I'm going to talk about Zero Trust. I'm certainly going to talk about insights and segmentation, our two products. But what I'm really going to talk about is the fact that we live in a world where finally everybody not only acknowledges, but everybody acknowledges, agrees, and operates from the place that we all know breaches are here to stay. And unfortunately, they're part of life. And we have to not pretend that we can stop them all or prevent them all, but that we have to live with them. And what Illumio does for its customers is we try and make sure that none of those breaches are catastrophic. We use analysis and insights and segmentation as ways to find and stop the spread of breaches once they make it inside, and to take what could be a catastrophic problem and hopefully make it a very small problem in the process.
Yeah, you're obviously in the middle of, I don't know that we can talk about a lot of the customers, but you are the backbone of a lot of really important institutions around the world who care deeply about this. But even just going back to, I love how the discussion of segmentations evolved over the time, and it sounds like a real techie word, but I've had it explained, I think, by you as thinking about maybe a submarine or some other common analogies. Maybe play out one of those, like how should we think about segmentation and how does it compare to other things we've seen in life?
Yes, Steve, you've been around long enough to go through the iterations of analogies that we've had over the years, but the submarine one has stuck around since almost the very beginning. And I sort of tell the story that if I hand even a child a crayon and a piece of paper and I say, draw a submarine, there's sort of that generic picture of the long tube, and usually they draw a periscope, of course, popping out of the top. But what most people don't draw, but everybody knows, is that inside of that long tube, inside of the submarine, are compartments. And it's always been built that way. And the reason why is so that if there's a leak, you have the ability to stop the spread of the leak, to close that one compartment off and make sure that although that one compartment floods, the rest of the boat and obviously everything and all the people inside stay safe and dry, and you can bring the boat to the surface and repair it, and life goes on. It's a small problem, but it's not a catastrophic problem. And if I simply remove those compartments from the submarine and I have that exact same leak, that leak will eventually fill the whole boat and it will sink and it will be a catastrophe. And so in a lot of ways, segmentation is like the compartments that we build in order to make sure that when a breach occurs or a piece of ransomware gets inside, although it is still a problem, and nobody's ever going to deny that, even a small problem is still a problem. It's a lot better to have a small problem than a catastrophic sized one.
I always like that. I think the other analogy has always been kind of a castle where, everyone who knows medieval castles, they have like a drawbridge and walls, and you keep the bad people out, the invaders. But if they're in the castle, then you sort of assume everyone's toast. so, so I think the idea of segmentation is historically cybersecurity is like protect at the walls, don't let anything bad in. But this is like adding interior walls and doors within the castle. So it's just to sort of mix up a bunch of analogies. But I think it's really profound. I mean, I think those who aren't really steeped in cybersecurity may not realize this is a totally different way of thinking about security. It's not just, stop at the castle walls. It's really a new way of assuming things will happen bad. Let's minimize their impact.
It definitely is. And I started off by saying it's an exciting time because this is now a change in mindset. And the reason why that's exciting for me and for the team at Illumio is until you get to a place where the CISOs and the security practitioners around the world walk into work in the morning and acknowledge that a breach or a piece of ransomware is going to be, unfortunately, something they have to deal with, where they start the day by saying, we may be safe today, we may be safe tomorrow, but a week from now, we may not be. If they don't adopt that mindset, then they're never going to ask the question, what do we do when that problem occurs? There's sort of a funny story about this word that's now become very popular around the world in cybersecurity, resiliency. Everybody's talking about resiliency, CISOs, boards of directors, regulators. Well, you don't need to think about resiliency unless you acknowledge that at some point you're going to have a problem, because the act of recovering from a problem requires a problem in the first place. So there is no resiliency without problems. And I think there's a parallel there where we're recognizing that with the world so connected and so hyper connected in so many ways, and all of the infrastructure that's now being built and stood up to make all this possible, it's impossible to imagine a world where there isn't a breach, there isn't a piece of ransomware, there isn't a successful attack once in a while. Unfortunately for us, it's been a lot more often than once in a while, but we ought to at least acknowledge that it's going to happen.
Yeah, I love that. And again, this has been quite a journey to get to where we are, but you're in New York right now. I know that's where a lot of the customers are. Can you share any anecdotes on like what are, I'm going to brag for Andrew for a moment. His relationships with the CIOs, the chief information officers at the banks, is on a first name basis, on a very regular basis. And it's largely because I think your personality, but also because you've just brought some pretty cool solutions. But anything you can share about recent customer deployments or top of mind, what they're asking you about?
Yeah, so even though the audience would have no way of knowing this, I actually owe all of you an apology because I was a little late getting here. And the reason for that was because I was with one of our big financial customers here in New York, and the meeting went a lot longer than I expected. And what's funny is in all these conversations that we're having now, there is absolutely a common thematic. Certainly we talk about segmentation a lot, but this notion of simply having better observability, of being able to find not a needle in a haystack, but all the needles in all the haystacks. And the reason I say that is we used to have one haystack. It was called the data center. And that's what every enterprise ran off of. But now, including the customer I was just with, a brand that would be known all over the world, you don't have one haystack. You've got multiple haystacks. You've got your AWS and your Azure and your GCP. And if you operate overseas, you probably have a handful of clouds that are not the three big ones here in the US. You probably still have your data center. You certainly have all that end user compute that you've got in the hands of all of your team members. We've built an incredibly complex hybrid mesh to support all this stuff that we live our lives on and that we operate our businesses on. And one of the themes that I think is coming out more and more is that it's gotten difficult and in most cases impossible to have any kind of real observability, but not just to create a whole bunch of noise and then hopefully stumble into a needle, but to actually have the kind of observability that allows you to find the needles in real time and then to know what to do to take action on them. That host that suddenly gets hit by ransomware, the breach that started in November and now it's September the following year and you didn't know for the first 11 months it was going on. And so every customer is talking to me about how do I see more, but also see the right things a lot faster.
I love that. And to some extent, this company, the name Illumio, was sort of around illumination and sort of bringing visibility. I think we kind of morphed into that over time. No, it's great. Andrew spends a lot of time with customers, as you can tell. He's very low energy with also.
I was going to say one thing, Steve, which is, as you know all too well from my travel schedule, COVID had me grounded like everybody else for a couple of years there. And there was a lot of goodness in being off the road and being home for a little bit. But I'm a huge believer that relationships get built sitting across the table. That allows you to then have the text, the signal, the phone call, the Teams, the Zooms, but the actual infrastructure and foundation of a relationship is built sitting across the table from somebody. And those other tools then enable you to manifest the relationship lots of different ways, but they'll never be a replacement for sitting in that conference room for an hour plus like I just did and having that conversation about where are they trying to go and why.
No, I think you're very unique at that. And that's a good segue. I wanted to shift a little bit from, we talked about what Illumio sells and it's kind of the problems, but I think that how you built it and your role in this is pretty fascinating. Andrew is the co-founder along with PJ, and they started this company 13, 14 years ago. And it's pretty rare for someone to both be the founder and still running what's now a much, much, much larger organization as the CEO. So let's just spend a little bit of time, like you were at SimTech, a smaller company as a VP of sales and running a different roles, but just maybe go back in time a little bit to when you all decided to start Illumio and why, and if you had any clue what was coming up ahead if you would have done it again. You can tell me that later if you want, but I think just bring me back into the mindset of starting Illumio.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the comments that nowadays gets made, and I actually push back on it pretty hard. It goes all the way back to the beginning in 2013, but it's a comment that I push back on hard. Sometimes people will say to me or to other members of the Illumio team, you guys really created the segmentation category. And I push back on that right away. And what I often say is, number one, we definitely didn't create the category because I don't believe that vendors create categories. I think that categories and markets are created by customers, and there's a process, and it's not necessarily one that's ever planned or spoken about deliberately, but customers will have a problem. They'll look for a solution to that problem. They won't find one, or at least one that seems to make sense. There's a lot of bumbling around that goes on in those early days. A couple of vendors, maybe big ones that are incumbents or small startups, try and figure out how to build something against that problem. And they may get it right, but they also may get it wrong. Probably not either one or the other, but a mix. And over time, it evolves. And the category and the market get created when enough customers have two things in common. One is they agree that they have the problem, because that's the size of the market. And then they agree on what I think in our industry we would call a reference architecture, but what I'm going to call it is just a common solution. In other words, enough customers agree we have this problem, and enough customers say, we want to solve it with something that looks like this. And then, of course, the vendor race begins to see who is actually going to be the big winner in that market. I think it's incredibly important to differentiate between a company creating a market and customers creating a market, because that is definitely the founding story of Illumio, and I think it is for a lot of companies. We didn't start the company because we said, we think that we should go build this. What we did was, PJ and I literally sitting around talking about this years ago said, we think that the traditional network-based firewall with cables going in and out of the back is going to experience challenges in a world that's more virtualized, more hybrid, more cloud-friendly or cloud-centric. We thought that the act of sitting and writing thousands of firewall rules based on IP addresses that tell you how a telephone call gets made between point A and point B was looking backwards, not looking forwards, and that things like labels and cloud tags were the future. And when we started to realize how much things could change, that's when we said, we think that we've got a theory on what that solution needs to look like in that new world. And the good and the bad of that is we figured out something and built something that was dramatically different than how things had been built and done in the past. The bad news is we were probably a little too early. And although we figured out probably the right direction, and although we didn't build the perfect thing, we built something that directionally was right. I think with hindsight, which is 2020 vision, of course, I think we now know we got there earlier than we realized, and the world took longer to move in this direction for us and the other vendors in this space than any of us thought it would. Now, if you're playing long ball and you're building for the long-term story, it probably doesn't matter if you're a little too early or even a little too late. It only matters if you're way too early or way too late. But I will say that we definitely, with hindsight, know that we were probably there earlier than we ever imagined. And that caused a lot of difficulty and pain, quite frankly, in the early years of the company's life at times.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think you can be directionally right and you can have the best tech solution, but if customers aren't ready to prioritize it or put budget behind it, that comes hard. And that led to maybe we can go into the building of the company even deeper, which is, not surprisingly, the same thing that makes you good as a salesperson makes you good at raising capital and telling a story. But so you were able to raise some good money, and then you kind of got this founding team together. Do you remember some of the early either challenges or interesting things about building those first handful of employees that were along for the ride?
Yeah, a couple of points in there that even though it was a long time ago, I remember them like they were yesterday. First of all, I'll tell you that one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got, and I've been lucky to have an incredible group of investors, many of whom are also friends and mentors. And one of the best pieces of advice I got in those early days was raise when you can, as much as you can. And I'm not saying that line applies to every CEO or every founder or every business, but we recognized fairly early on that we were building something that was complicated, that it was going to probably take more resource in every sense of the word than we anticipated going into it. We definitely got the sense that we were earlier in a market, or maybe even too early in the market, which meant if we were right, it was going to take longer. And an anecdote that one of our investors shared with me was the difference in being very, very, very early and being too early, TOO, is actually literally just one word: bankruptcy. And it sounds funny to say it that way, but if you think about it, you could be directionally right. You could be doing all the right things and executing on all the right things. And if you're very, very, very early, you're probably not going to have enough revenue. And therefore, your fundraising is going to be the thing that keeps you alive until you end up being right and the market's there. If you're too early, you don't have enough revenue, you don't have enough funding, and you go broke. And I think for us, we were very fortunate. We were able to raise a lot of money early in the company's life when we needed it, and when it was an incredible insurance blanket or an insurance policy. We were careful and judicious. So despite the fact that we raised what at that time was a huge amount of money for an enterprise software company, we raised a $100 million Series C round back when a $100 million round was a really, really big deal. And we did it when we had no revenue. We basically did it at the launch of the product. But we also never forgot that money was the insurance policy on the business. And therefore, we spent it very, very carefully. And the one place where we definitely were not shy, as you mentioned, was the early employees and the early team. We knew what we were building was complicated. We went out and hired the best engineers that we could in those first 2+ years when we were in stealth mode. We didn't really hire a whole lot of other things other than really great product people and engineers. But we weren't shy about going into the biggest companies in the Valley and making sure that we tried to pull the best people out and using this one asset that we had, the story, and then the money, in order to try and convince them to jump on board and go for the journey early on. And momentum is a very powerful force in the universe. So once you get a little bit going, whether it's in fundraising or hiring, the flywheel definitely helps out. And it did for us in those early days.
It's pretty unique, your company versus others. You've kind of been very Silicon Valley centric, certainly for the product side of things from the start, and very in-office oriented. You think that's a result of your in-person personality, or that was just the way it was done at the time and we've continued it?
So I first of all, I think pre-COVID, it absolutely was the way that it was done at the time. All those buildings that we see up and down 101, they were built for a reason. And for the most part, before COVID, they were generally full 5 days a week for a reason. One of the things that myself and the leadership team at Illumio made a decision on coming out of COVID was that while everybody was, and I don't want to say generically because there were different directions of over-rotation, but there was the over-rotation of you must be back. There was the over-rotation of we're never coming back. And one of the things that we sort of said was again, not claiming to be right or wrong, but just maybe the Illumio culture and the Illumio team, we said, what we were doing before COVID seemed to work pretty well. Generally speaking, people came to work every day. If your dog was sick or your child was sick or your friend was sick, or if you were sick, we really encouraged you to stay home. We were flexible. The Valley in particular has strange traffic hours sometimes. So if somebody came in a little early or came in a little late because it worked better for the commute, we were generally okay with all that. And so what we did was, instead of over-rotating on a new operating model, we just said to the team, why don't we go back to the operating model that we had been using for years that seemed to work? We're flexible, but we like being together. We're more productive when we're all in a room together, but we don't need to be every minute of the day, 5 days a week. And it took a little while, I think, for people to believe us. There's just been so much noise around what is the world supposed to be post-COVID. But once people realized we were serious about it, we're just going to go back to what we were doing before. And yes, that meant, generally speaking, most people come into the building 4 or 5 days a week, which was true before. And we had lots of flexibility whenever it was helpful and it made life easier, just like we did before. And we're fully back to that model now. We're loving being back in the building in Sunnyvale, and I'm loving being out on the road, seeing customers again. And the best part is that I always say this, I wouldn't be flying 40 or 45 weeks a year to go to empty buildings. So it's not just us that's back in. Our customers are clearly back in their buildings as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch all the different models, but this one's been pretty pure. Well, let's reflect a little bit too. Just again, I wanted to get into, like, the journey of a startup is like dog years, like everything's 7 times longer than it used to be. But we've been friends for 10 plus years, and we've gone through, you've had lawsuits, you've had huge competitive wins, you've had losses, fundraising, turnover of people, great hires. Just as you kind of reflect a little bit over the last 10, 11 years, what are some of the higher highs and some of the lower lows that have stuck with you through it?
Yeah. So first of all, it would be irresponsible, in my opinion, to start a conversation about the really good or the really bad by not acknowledging another piece of advice or anecdote that I got from another one of my mentors and one of your fellow shareholders, which is, on the days when you have a really big win, you're going to think you've got the entire thing figured out. You're done. And you're not. And on the days when you have a really bad day, you're going to think the world is coming to an end, and it's not. The highs are never as high as you think they are. The lows are never as bad as you think they are. It feels that way because we're people, and that's the emotional side of the journey. But the reality is, you're going to get up the next day, the world's still going to be spinning, and you got to go to work and you got to move forward. And it took a long time for me to understand how to embrace that and how to really not just say I'm embracing it, but actually have the mindset of, the great day is great. We should definitely celebrate them, and we should pat ourselves on the back when we accomplish something really big. But we're going to go to work the next day, and we got to keep moving forward. And the same is true in the other direction. Look, when PJ came to me for the first time and we started talking about him potentially retiring, which is very much what it was, it was a terrible day. And I don't mean that because of what it meant for him or me or the company. I just simply mean, in the life of building something where you're side by side with a co-founder for years, it can't not be a terrible day when you talk about, for the first time, the potential of that not being true one day going forward. And so I think what you eventually get to when you've been doing it in dog years long enough is you realize that as the leader, and it could be CEO, it could be chief product officer, it could be chief people officer, but as one of the leaders, the biggest part of your job is to really embrace the fact that you have to be unflappable, that you have to make sure that the team knows that it's going to be okay the next day. And if it was great today, it might not be as great tomorrow. And if it was terrible today, it's probably going to be better tomorrow. But every single day you got to get up and you just got to take one step in front of the other, one foot in front of the other, and move forward. And, and they're definitely, I think about, PJ and I talking about him leaving was one of those tough days. I've said for a long time, whenever I talk to our interns or I go back to WashU a couple times a year and I talk to the students, inevitably the question comes up, what's the worst part of your job? I don't know anybody who's ever managed one person, 1,000 people, or 100,000 people that won't tell you that the single worst thing that you have to do is firing somebody. there is just a human element, even when it is absolutely the right thing for the company and even for the person. It's still the toughest thing in the world to have that conversation, but you do it because it's both part of the job. And when you do it for the right reasons, it's the right thing for the company and very often for the person, but it doesn't make it any easier or any more fun. And so, I think about those moments, but now I really understand how you just have to get up and it's just one foot in front of the other day after day. That's what building is.
I think that's a good way to put it. And I think especially these days too, when you have competition coming out of nowhere with new products and you have everyone bringing up AI and are you an AI company? And it's just the noise has only increased as the valley has gotten wilder, I assume, over the last several months here.
Well, I will definitely say that, certainly the AI conversation has increased the volume of everything. The noise around all spaces, including cyber, but definitely around things like hiring. But I guess that's also part of sort of one foot in front of the other day by day. There's the noise you listen to because it actually affects what you do, how you hire. But there's also a lot of noise that's just for noise's sake in today's world. And making sure that the team remembers that we don't have to listen to everything just because it's noise out there. And, it's funny how some of these topics tie together. We talked about the early days of Illumio and when there wasn't really a category or market. And I remember, and you were in the boardroom back then, so you'll remember as well, maybe we need to pivot. Maybe we're wrong and we should do something else with the money we have in our bank and build something different. And sometimes you have to have those conversations because having it is part of the process. But there are also times where you have to have conviction despite the noise in the room. And one of the things that, the Illumio team and thankfully the board who supported us, we all had high conviction that segmentation was a real and growing problem and something that nobody had solved well yet. And we may have been earlier than we thought, but we were determined to stay the path. And obviously here sitting in 2025, I'm ecstatic that we did, but it would have been easy to hear the noise and say, well, maybe it won't be a market. Maybe it won't ever grow to be a meaningful category. Maybe we should go in a different direction. And, that there's a time to listen and then there's a time to sort of say, this is what we're doing. And the noise around all these things sometimes makes it a little harder to not be distracted, but that's also part of one foot in front of the other moving forward every day.
Just keep swimming, as I think Nemo once said. So let's shift to kind of how you're managing as CEO of a many 100-person company with big numbers and a lot of the world's infrastructure kind of counting on us. That could be, if you stop and think about it, it can be pretty stressful. But tell me, like, you're on the road a ton and you have a great young family, you have a lot of stuff going on. How do you manage your time and your stress? What are some hints and tips and tricks that you've developed over the years?
Yep. So I will say that I'm not a runner and I would never claim to be a runner, but I run 5 to 7 days a week. I certainly do it because it is physically, I'm sure, not the worst thing in the world that I could do for myself, but I do it almost entirely for just the mental relief. It's that 20 to 40 minutes a day when I can tune everything out. Although I could listen to a podcast or watch something on my iPad or turn on the TV and watch CNBC in front of me, I don't. I usually just put on music and I just go. It's a disconnect, and I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. I will say that one of the things that I finally got over myself is that, like many people, I was you must get up early in the morning and do it first thing. And in the post-COVID world where Teams and Zoom and being on the road again, I don't have any kind of structure around it anymore. There are days where it happens at 5:30 in the morning, and there are days where it's at 4 in the afternoon when I've got a 45-minute break. And I don't worry about that anymore the way I used to. But I really do try and do it. I think it's an important part. Part of it is just having a routine, and part of it is just doing anything physical, any kind of exercise on a regular basis, I think is great for your head and certainly not bad for your body. The other trick, and because I do travel so much and it is so across the world, the other trick is I believe that your body takes its cues from two things more than anything else. One is eating and the other one is sleeping. And so I have a rule, which is when I get off a plane, whatever time it says on the clock on the wall, not the one on my wrist that still says California back home, Whatever time it says on the wall is what time it is. And I tell myself that, and then I act accordingly. If I fly to Japan and I leave California in the middle of the night and I land there at 4:50 a.m., it's breakfast time or whatever we're going to call that. What it is not is it's not the middle of the night. It's not dinner time. It doesn't matter what time it is back in California. And I'm very, very, I'll say I am very, very rigorous about my routine on the road. I don't mess around with it. It works. Probably should sleep a little bit more, but I do it at the right time when it's dark out, not during the day when it's light out, no matter how tired I am. And so I try and stick to those routines, and then a lot of work in between.
Yeah, I can imagine. And when you're not traveling or doing the work thing too, and running, just tell me about kind of the weekend that you might have these days. Are you off checking out different events or going to sporting events or hanging with the family, or what do you do when you're not on, which is not a ton of your time, I know.
I was going to say, if we're talking about quality, it's high on the list. If we're talking about quantity, it's very low. Most of my friends know I am something between a lifelong and completely insane lifelong Mets fan. That's the New York Mets. That's definitely my team and has been my whole life. I will tell you, it's very rare that they're playing that I'm not watching. And if that means I'm at dinner and my phone is right next to me on the booth or on the chair, that may be what it is. But I'm typically watching at least, these months of the year that they're playing. So that's probably one of the things high on the list. And then, like everybody, I'm trying to find time to see my friends and spend the little bit of time I can with my family. My family's all remote to California, so I don't have the luxury of being able to get in the car and drive down the block, but FaceTime works well, and there's plenty of that. And so it's like I said, it's low on quantity, but I try and make it high quality.
That's excellent. And one other question is, if you've always been I think you've been in cybersecurity kind of your whole life, right? Which is, I actually have largely as well. I think there's something that draws people to that. But hypothetically, if you weren't working in the cybersecurity industry, are there other industries, even beyond software, that you've always been enamored with? Or maybe you'd run the Mets. I don't know. But any other industries?
I was going to say, sorry, I was going to say, yeah, I'd want to play for the Mets, but unfortunately, I've sent my resume in a number of times over the years and nobody's called. So we'll strike that one off the list. Running it is a good idea. I hadn't thought about that. I guess I'd have to call Steve Cohen in New York and see if he'd be looking for somebody new to do the job since he bought the team. Again, I'm reasonably certain if I sent my resume to the office, I probably wouldn't get a call back. So we're going to have to strike that one off the list. I'll tell you, I don't talk about it often. It doesn't come up often. But when I went to WashU, I graduated with a degree in finance, and I actually really loved studying it. Everything except for QBA resonated really, really well with me. And I thought, at least for a moment or two, that I was going to move back to New York where I grew up, and I was going to go to work on Wall Street. I didn't really know exactly what that meant. Now I understand how that world works pretty well, given obviously, all the banks that we do work for and have as customers. And as CEO, obviously spending some amount of time talking to bankers and corporate treasury and the different groups within those banks. I never really got far enough down the road to think about what part of that universe I might operate in. But I will say that there's definitely, as I've made friends in that world over the years, there are some overlaps. There's a lot of selling that goes on. There's a huge amount of customer service and customer facing time. So things like banking, they're certainly very different than cyber, but there are similarities in some of the skill sets. And I think that's probably the one other place in the world that I don't think I could see it today. I certainly thought it back then, and I guess I could probably see it if I had taken a really hard right turn instead of a left turn.
Maybe you'd be buying Illumio from some other person in your role. That'd be kind of very, very meta. Well, let's talk about one last topic, which is just your own leadership style. You started, as you said, you and PJ kind of had this idea, and you're doing early stage pre-revenue, and fast forward today, you have a huge executive team, you have lots of employees, you have lots of big customers, and you talked about the not letting the highs get too high and not letting the lows get too low, and just kind of keep moving forward. But just tell me a little bit more about like, how has like your style evolved as you've gotten to this level of customer and employee demands, and kind of what are some of the pieces of leadership that are most important to you as you go forward here?
So it's obviously a question that I think a lot of leaders, and certainly ones that are a lot more visible than I am, people running public companies, obviously, I think it's a question that a lot of people have wrestled with, and there was wrestling with it through the COVID period and then the post-COVID world. There is one sort of like grounding thing for me that I've tried to stick to, and now I'm really sticking to it. In other words, I think as the company gets bigger, as the visibility around the company goes up, there is a temptation to sort of sculpt an image or sculpt a style. But there is something that I really believe, and I think when you do it naturally. It shows through. People talk about transparency, obviously talk about honesty. I think there's a different word, and it doesn't mean the same thing, which is authenticity. I am a kid who was born in Brooklyn, New York. I've still got a tiny bit of the accent to prove it. I was raised in New York. I went to WashU in St. Louis and moved to California, but I'm a New Yorker probably at heart, and at least part of my brain is wired that way. And there's an authenticity, and it's not an authenticity of being from Brooklyn. It's whoever you are. And I think when you show up authentically, even if you may choose your words carefully, even if you may be delivering a message that you want to land a certain way with a certain audience, you can do all that, but the authenticity still shows through. And it's when you start to be something or someone different than you actually are, that all of a sudden it becomes very obvious that you're doing something that isn't you. And so, yes, there is no doubt about it. I'm the first to acknowledge that when I get up in front of a team that's now 800 people, I obviously may be a little bit more careful with my words than I would have been when we were 6 or 8 or 10 sitting around the conference room table. That's part of the job. If I'm on camera and I'm talking to a broad audience, I'm going to think about how I say things a little differently than I might if I'm sitting with my executive team, partly because it's a small, intimate group that I know well and the other is not, partly because it may be a broader group coming from broader backgrounds, and I want to make sure that the message lands in a way that makes sense to a broader audience. But the authenticity shouldn't go away no matter what the frame of the situation is. I am who I am. And I think, fortunately, I think we're seeing more and more leaders recognizing that the authenticity has to stick through the whole journey. Because the minute that you turn that off, you're changing who you are, and whatever made you a leader, hopefully a good leader, when you start to change yourself, you have to know that you're going to change things along with it, and there are going to be consequences. So that's been a big and it's been a very important thing for me, especially the last couple of years, because the company has grown a lot and faster in the last couple of years than it ever did before. And I want to make sure that I feel like I'm showing up as the same person that I was in those early days.
That's really good. No, I can personally attest to your stylistically and who you are has really always come through, even as your stage has grown much larger and the expectations have been really growing with it, which is great. Well, this has been fantastic, Andrew. I just, it's really a pleasure after we spent so much time together over the years. I never get to sit down and just kind of ask you questions, but it's been a really amazing journey, kind of being your friend, but also just watching you take an idea and turn it into a really pivotal company at this point. So I look very fondly on all these years, and I just can't wait to see what's next. I think it'll be another set of journeys ahead, but I think they'll be really good ones.
I can't thank you enough for having me. I feel the exact same way. We've been partners in this now for a long time. And as I said many times, it's all about what happens tomorrow. And I'm more excited about tomorrow than I am about yesterday or today. And as long as that's the case, it's a lot of fun to go to work every day.
Well, thanks so much. I hope everyone enjoyed hearing more about Andrew's story. And I assure you, this isn't the last you've heard of him. It'll be really interesting to watch as we go ahead.